Welcome to this lecture on post-structuralist literary criticism. This is NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. We are in module 4 of our series of lectures collectively entitled English Language and Literature. Module 4, as you know, is devoted to literary criticism. The last lecture was devoted to structuralism and structuralist literary criticism, and today's lecture is on post-structuralism. There are obviously several texts that you may want to consult as far as post-structuralism in general and post-structuralist literary criticism in particular are concerned. However, for beginners, I would recommend a useful book, Beginning Theory by Peter Barry. You may also look up, particularly for deconstruction, Barbara Johnson's well-known book, The Critical Difference. As with other lectures, I shall be taking extracts and referring to a couple of other texts as well, in a bit to explain what post-structuralist criticism is all about. Well, let us begin. Before talking about the relation between post-structuralism and structuralism, let us begin by looking at what Chris Barker in his Sage Handbook of Cultural Studies says about post-structuralism. And let me read from him. The prefix post clearly suggests after. Thus, post-structuralism is after structuralism, in that the terms of this philosophical stream are ones that involve both the absorption of key ideas from structuralism and a critique and transformation of them, right. So, post is not simply a temporal prefix, right. Post here means that, well, we only take off or take off from structuralism, right, retaining some of its key ideas and at the same time critiquing those ideas and attempting to transform them, as we shall see in a while. Now, from a philosophical point of view, as one critic has mentioned here, post-structuralism looks at knowledge and problematizes it. Knowledge is not a question of true discovery, but of the construction of interpretations, okay, about the world that are taken to be true. Insofar as the idea of truth has an historical purchase, it is the consequence of power, that is, of whose interpretations come to count as truth, right. So, the two important words here are A, interpretation, and B, power, right. Post-structuralism, like post-enlightenment thinking, for instance postmodernism, does not believe in what we call truth with a capital T, right. Post-structuralism says that there are many, perhaps innumerable interpretations that one may give or one may bear upon a particular text. Okay. These interpretations are, to use a common word in post-structuralism, are slippery. Okay. They are not about the true discovery of what a literary text is about. Okay. Post-structuralism says that in this variety, or in these, if I may use the word, in these plethora of interpretations, okay, those interpretations have a ring of truth about them, or are considered to be true interpretations, which have to do with power. Okay? It says here that it is as a consequence, right, as a consequence of power that interpretations come to be true, right. For example, it is not that it happens only in post-structuralism. For instance, if you go back and look at the criticism that was there before or prior to feminist literary criticism, okay, those criticisms or those critical ways of critical analysis or critical tools, right, counted as true. Okay. When we had feminism as a critical methodology, we found that feminism gave a different interpretation of the text and challenged the the hegemonic and masculinist way of reading text, okay, where there is an erasure of the woman, right. So, we move on and we then understand that post-structuralism has to do, of course, with interpretation, language games and power. It is well within the linguistic turn that was inaugurated by structuralism, okay, and understands ways of talking, understands interpretations, discussions and analysis as language games, right. And you know that language games is a term that comes from the philosopher Wittgenstein. Okay. So, there are ways of talking. For instance, to put it very simply, there are ways in which we talk when we are in a certain scenario, right. For instance, when we are talking to our seniors, there is a way in which we speak. When we talk, when you go to a restaurant and when we order a meal, there is it's a different way in which we speak. Okay. So, instead of talking about truths, then Wittgenstein talked about language games. There are different ways of talking in language. So, post-structuralism also falls within this kind of within this orientation of thinking, laying more importance not on one way of reading a text, but on interpretation, language games and power. So, if we quickly go back to our lecture on structuralism, we had found in the last lecture that within structuralism, meaning is always differential and relational, right. Post-structuralism also shares these aspects of meaning being differential in a system, okay, meaning emanating in a in relation to other units in the system. However, there is a difference. Remember, we had said right in the beginning that post-structuralism critiques, it's not only coming after structuralism and retaining some of structuralism's core concepts, but also it is a critique and a transformation of those concepts, right. In structuralism, we saw that meaning was basically an outcome of the organization of science, okay, and there was a certain stability, right. These structures in structuralism gave us certain stability of meaning. Okay. Now, if you talk about the revision, the reorientation or the transformation that is brought about by post-structuralism, then this is where we must first look at. Okay. Stability through structures. Post-structuralism critiques radically the very stability of the structure that is celebrated, so to speak, by structuralism. Okay. In a way, we may say that post-structuralism questions, right, the structurality of the structure. You follow? What did we find in structuralism? That we can have meaning in a text. We can have meaning in a text by looking at the differential relation, okay, relationship between or among words or among different units of a text. Okay. There are certain codes, for instance, given the 5 codes given by Rolla Barthes. There are certain codes by which meaning can be teased out from a text, okay, and the text is a structure which is more or less stable, right. In post-structuralism, particularly through the work of the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, we will find that the stability is an illusion, okay, replaced by another word which is the slipperiness of the text, right. So, from this is the core, the radical break as far as structuralism is concerned when we talk about post-structuralism. Therefore, we may say that in post-structuralism, whereas in structuralism, that is, meaning is arrived at, okay, meaning is possible by looking at the structure and studying the text through codes. In post-structuralism, we find that the meaning of a text is endlessly deferred. This is the word, to defer, or we may say to postpone. The meaning of a text is always postponed, right. Why? This is what we need to understand. Now, if you understand why it is considered in post-structuralism that meaning is, forever postponed, then you would have understood one of the core claims of post-structuralism. Okay. Here we have a very important word given to us by Jacques Derrida, that is difference, right. This is a word that collapses two words, to differ and to defer. Okay. The differing part we have already found in structuralism, but Derrida adds another component to this difference which it together calls difference, that is to defer, that is again as I said in the previous slide, through the previous slide, the postponing of meaning. Now, what we will do is we will quickly look at another insight given to us, and this is by Pramod K. Nair in his useful book, An Introduction to Cultural Studies. Let us read and I shall explain this. Nair says that thus reading or interpretation is the movement through the chain of signs seeking a temporary meaning from or at each halt, right. Even if there is a feeling of having arrived at a meaning, in post-structuralism we have to admit, or post-structuralism needs us to admit, that there is only a temporary closure of meaning of the text. Okay, because of the slipperiness of the sign, which I shall come to in a while, because of the slipperiness of the sign, meaning is very temporary, and in the next instance the meaning is gone or the meaning is deferred, okay, to have another meaning come up. So, then he says this suggests that every signifier, that is a word or a sign, leads not to a stable end signified, but to more signifiers. Now, what did we see in structuralism? In structuralism we saw that, for instance, these letters T, R, E and E, or the syllable tree, right, brings to our mind the concept, right, the concept of tree, not a real tree, but the concept or the psychological impression, as Ferdinand de Saussure would call it, the psychological impression of tree. We also agreed that a tree may mean different things in different circumstances. For instance, if you are doing a tree diagram sitting underneath a tree, the tree diagram in your laptop, and I come along and say that that's a beautiful tree. Okay? So, there is an ambiguity here. The tree may refer to the tree under which you are sitting, or it may refer to the tree diagram, right. So, meaning is slippery even in structuralism, but structuralism held that there is difference in context, all right, but one would eventually understand that the tree is referred to here is either of this. Okay. In post-structuralism, however, it is a little different. Since meaning comes about, right, owing to a system of difference, okay, it not only differs, but the meaning is also deferred. Why? Because every signifier, right, carries, this is the word, carries echoes from other signifiers. Okay. So, that meaning is never arrived at in complete totality or complete certainty. Do you follow? Okay. So, this suggests, as Pramod K. Nair says, this suggests that every signifier that is word or sign, leads not to a stable end signified, but to more signifiers. This implies that meaning is never fully graspable and the final meaning is always postponed, or as we saw a while ago, deferred, right, because words carry the echoes of other words, leading to a final ambiguity. Okay. So, this is also called what Derrida calls the aporia, right, that the impossibility of any meaning for that matter, that is called the slipperiness of language, right. Derrida also uses a very important phrase which he says, where he says that in language there are no pure signifieds, right. The signifier signified, which we found was very neatly drawn out in structuralism, by Ferdinand de Saussure. What happens here is the signified can never be known in its totality, okay, because there are always because the sign is always under erasure, right, under erasure by its the fact that it is in a relation, it is in relation with other terms in the system. Fine. Therefore, these are non-essentialist and non-ontological categories. And finally, we understand that language is socially constructed and language is never to be fully grasped. Therefore, we can look at a text as a play of signifiers, not allowing any stable meaning. Now, I hope you have understood this. Okay? Text is seen as a play of signifiers, and if you look at this slide here, there are no, in language there are no pure or stable signifieds. Okay? So, if you have a term, a signifier, and you feel that you have understood what it signifies, Derrida and other post-structuralists would say that no, there is no stability in the signified, okay, because it is always and it's already too meshed in with other terms in the system. In that sense, a text also is open to innumerable interpretations of words. Now, let me put a caveat here. This is in no way is Derrida saying that there should be an irresponsible play of meaning in a text, that nor is he saying that you can do anything with the text and you can give any ridiculous interpretation of a text. What he is asking us to understand is the very nature of language itself, right. He says that language by its very nature is not stable, right. There is always, or if I may use the word, a contamination, so to speak, okay, by other words in the system. Do you understand? So, in a way, if you look at it, we do not have to deconstruct a text because of the nature of the relation between the signifier and signified in post-structuralism vis-a-vis structuralism. We find that meaning is not at all possible in the first place. Okay? So, the text really is already deconstructed. Okay? You do not have to perform deconstruction on the text. The text comes to you, okay, incomplete. The text comes to you, amenable to several and different interpretations. So, we are not to say that this interpretation is correct. If somebody says that this interpretation or a particular interpretation is correct, then that is, according to post-structuralists, an act of power, an act of hegemony, an act of trying to pin down the text when actually there are so many other interpretations available. Remember this, the detractors of post-structuralism would always or mostly think that what Derrida has done is played a sort of dirty trick on us, right. The kind of trick that a charlatan would do. In fact, charlatan is a word that is used against, has been used against Derrida. But the point is, what he's saying here is, what he calls the metaphysics of presence. He says that the entire Western philosophy is sort of, if I may use the word, plagued by the metaphysics of presence. Okay, how should I say it? The privileging, right? We saw binary oppositions in the last lecture. He says the privileging of one part of the binary opposition over another. Let's say man, woman, okay, culture, nature, right? Strength, weakness, light and darkness. Okay, there is always a privileging of one side, okay, of the binary scheme, right. And that is why he says that this is this is a way of thinking in Western philosophy that has to be deconstructed, okay. And language by itself shows that it is already slippery and not graspable in its totality. Therefore, we may use terms like deferral, substitution and supplementation. We will not go into this because there is a lot more to be talked about. Therefore, a text, now look at this slide here, a text is therefore always, any text for that matter, not just a literary text. A text is therefore always unstable and forever recreated. You may recreate the meaning of a text. There was a recreation, or there is a recreation of Hamlet when you, for instance, when you talk from a feminist point, that too is a recreation, okay, from a feminist point of view, okay, when you talk about Gertrude, when you foreground Gertrude and Ophelia, and not Hamlet and Horatio or Hamlet Senior or even Claudius, right. So, in that sense, there is already foregrounding of the other part of the binary, right, of male and female characters, okay. That also is now, therefore, you can have a hybrid way of, a hybrid methodology, you say deconstructionist or feminist deconstructionist methodology, okay. So, the text therefore is forever recreated, right, by, again as I said, by refusing to accept the fact that a signifier means or can come to can refer to a totally or fully graspable meaning in its signified. Because of this gap between the signifier and the signified, there is enormous even political potential, right, in deconstructionist methodology to intervene in accepted and established power saturated meanings of texts. Therefore, interpretation, which we saw was a core concept in post-structuralism, interpretation is therefore shifting, and interpretation is contingent. Interpretation is contingent upon circumstances, it is contingent upon political orientations, political views. Okay. So, you may create different interpretations and meanings of a particular text depending on the contingent situation that you are in. This is, I would say, this is a tremendously liberating way of doing literary criticism. Okay. Perhaps those who those who are quite radical detractors of post-structuralism, it could be, as Nair says in one of his books, okay, Pramod Nair says in one of his books, that probably you are scared of losing authority, okay, when we have different meanings, okay, or meanings that are different from your interpretation clamoring for attention and establishing a different reading of a text, right. This is similar to what you find in Michel Foucault, another post-structuralist, okay, when he says that meaning is always regulated by power, right. Meaning is not to be seen in terms of a chain of eternal deferrals only. Okay. According to Foucault now here, if you look at this, according to Foucault, there is no point in finding innumerable meanings in a text. He says, well, what's the point of then it becomes actually play, in that sense of like a game for Michel Foucault. He says there is no point in only substituting one meaning with another meaning, right. He says it's most important, he says we do this, but it's most important again to show how these different meanings come from different sources of power or the absence of power. Do you understand? Therein Foucault gives us a caution, a note of caution, that there is no point in playing a game of how many different meanings I can find out from a text. The job is a more important, a more significant one, that is of finding out how meaning is always regulated by power, by systems of power in society. Okay. Now, quickly if we look at the attitude of post-structuralism and structuralism towards language, and I think this is from Peter Berry. I've taken it from Peter Berry's book. The attitude to language in structuralism is this: structuralists think that the world is constructed through language, and that we do not have access to reality other than through the linguistic medium. You remember from our last lecture that structuralism says that language constructs reality. Language is the only way through which we can apprehend reality, and there are obviously chances that we can never apprehend the whole of reality. Why? Because it comes to us through the linguistic medium, right? Post-structuralism, the post-structuralists assert that they do not have full control over the medium of language. Linguistic anxiety, this is a very nice way of putting it. Linguistic anxiety is the keynote of post-structuralism. Now, look at this again. Okay, we do not have access to reality, says the say the post-structuralists. We do not have access to reality except through language. Okay, so fine, we may not know what reality is in its totality, but at least we know that we have created a reality for us based on language, okay, which is structured, a system that is structured, okay, where meaning emanates from a differential relationship between the units, or sorry, among the units. Okay. But you see how this break is made as when we come to post-structuralism. Post-structuralism also says that yes, our understanding of reality is largely the work of language, okay, but they add this very important point here, which is that this very language that we talk about is something that is something over which we do not have control. Even if we human beings have made language, even if we have constructed language, we have no control over the language. Now, why? Recall what I have said just a while ago, that is because of the very nature of language. Okay? The very fact, as Derrida argues, that there can never be any pure signifieds. Okay, because it is already, it's because the meaning of any term comes about only in relationship to other terms. How can we have a pure signified? Okay, pure, impure in the sense that it does not have look at this, this is most important, it does not have an ontological meaning about it. Do you follow? The meaning of chair is, or the word chair gives us a meaning or psychological impression of chair, not because there is something chairish about a chair, okay, but because it is different from other objects of furniture, right. So, do you follow this? Therefore, post-structuralists would say that yes, we understand the, when the structuralists tell us that reality is apprehendable only through language, but let us remind ourselves that this very medium is a problematic one. Okay? So, the term linguistic anxiety, right? So, there is an anxiety even as you are using language, there is always this anxiety and high suspicion that you can never, that the meaning of a word or meaning of a sentence and even of a text is never to be the final one. Okay? It is forever in a state of deference, that is, it is forever differing and it is forever deferred. I hope you have understood this. Okay? Linguistic anxiety is the keynote of post-structuralism. So, we again now look at what the critic Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak talks about when she says that a word is always under erasure, right, from this French phrase which means under erasure. To write a word, cross it out and then print both word and deletion. For instance, you write print both word. So, you write print both word and deletion. You write this at the same time you have marked it. So, this means that you have written it, but you know that because you are trying to show, you are trying to demonstrate that you understand that these words print both word and deletion do not have their corresponding pure signifiers. And even as a string of words, it may not have or does not have rather a pure signified or a constant meaning. Okay. So, to write a word, cross it out and then print both word and deletion. This part that we have we have struck out, it simply means, or it is, as I said, an attempt to show that I am using words, but I know that these words are under erasure, or I know that their meanings are always deferred. So, this is way of showing showing that words do not have complete or full meanings. Okay. So, since the word is inaccurate, right, it is crossed out, and since it is necessary, it remains legible. So, you have the words there, at the same time you cross it out, or you cross the words out to show that they are necessary and at the same time they are inaccurate. Do you understand? It is not to say that every time we write, we are going to also cross out the words and keep them under erasure, just to show that, look, I am saying this, but I know that my words do not convey, or they are always under erasure. This is one way of just to show, so perhaps in a pictorial way, okay, what exactly is meant by this deferral of meaning or the erasure, or meaning being under erasure, right. So, I referred to Barbara Johnson's The Critical Difference, and I will quickly read from her in order to enrich what we are talking about. In The Critical Difference, published in 1981, Barbara Johnson says that the term deconstruction denotes a particular kind of practice. Okay? It is a kind of practice in reading, and thereby a method of criticism and mode of analytical inquiry. Many would say that deconstructive criticism is no criticism. How can it be a critical methodology when it itself talks about the deferral of meaning? So, deconstructive critical piece by itself is a failure, because deconstruction says that, well, no meaning is final. Now, that is, I would say, is taking it to quite as illogical extreme, in the sense that deconstruction does not say that because language is slippery, because there is linguistic anxiety, that we should stop talking at all, right. It knows that language is the only medium, as structuralists do, but it also cautions us that that medium is fraught with the lack of final meaning. It's pointless really. It's rather what we call arguing ad infinitum, or arguing even what was that term, arguing in complete absurdity. Okay, that the deconstructionists should not say anything about a text, because after all they say that, well, words have no meaning. Okay, that is not our point here. Our point is to understand that the deconstructionist will show you a different way, a different philosophical stance altogether. Okay. So, therefore, Johnson rightly says that, well, deconstruction is a kind of critical practice. It is a method. She even goes on to call it a method of criticism, okay, and a mode of analytical inquiry. Right. So, there is no reason to just throw the baby out with the bath water and to say that, well, deconstructionists have no place. They are saying something, and as critics like Johnson and Spivak say, we ought to listen. So, let us read on. The term deconstruction is not synonymous with destruction, very beautifully put. They do not, the deconstructionists do not destroy, post-structuralism does not destroy the text. Okay. So, we have to understand, to deconstruct is not a negative activity. Please understand this. To deconstruct is not a destructive ability, right, or a destructive tool, right. So, deconstruction is more like dismantling. When you dismantle something, you do not destroy it, right, you can put it back together. Okay. So, deconstruction is not synonymous with destruction. However, it is in fact much closer to the original meaning of the word analysis. which etymologically means to undo. So, we have to understand deconstruction in terms of undoing a text. Remember I said in terms of dismantling. So, dismantling, undoing is not the same as destruction, which etymologically means to undo, a virtual synonym for to deconstruct. If anything is destroyed in a deconstructive reading, says Johnson, it is not the text. This is very important, and I think she has put it so beautifully. If anything is destroyed at all, then it is certainly not the text, but the claim to unequivocal domination of one mode of signifying over another. Okay. So, she says deconstruction destroys the myth, destroys the illusion that there is only one dominant way of looking at a text or one dominant mode of signifying, right. A word signifies, and the words together, that is a text also signifies. So, if you say the text A meaning A, then we have to understand that behind that is or rather that itself, that pronouncement is an act of power, right, an act of hegemony. You are trying to sort of impose your meaning, your signification of a text, okay, over all others. So, if anything is destroyed in a deconstructive reading, it is not the text, but the claim to unequivocal domination of the mode of signifying over, of one mode of signifying over another. A deconstructive reading is a reading which analyzes the specificity of a text's critical difference from not other text from itself. So, beautifully put, we should say that a deconstructive reading analyzes a text's critical difference, or you could say a text's critical distance from its own self. Okay? That what it is purporting according to you, according to the reader. Okay? Because if there is no reader, there is no text in that sense in deconstructive criticism. What a deconstructive reading does is to show that what meaning is purported to come from a text. Okay? There is always a gap. Why? There is a gap because the words do not have pure signifieds or pure reference. Do you follow? Okay. Jonathan Culler, another critic, has this to say: deconstruction, if it is of any consequence, is not reducible to a specialized set of discursive procedures, right. It is a method, all right, but you cannot say that there is one way or set of procedures, a set of tools that you can use. While certainly deconstruction is not anti-methodological, neither could be called a discourse on method as such. Okay. Derrida says it is also at the very least a way of taking a position in its work of analysis concerning the political and institutional structures that make possible and govern our practices, our competencies and our performances. Remember, if somebody tells you that this is just a linguistic turn, okay, and that you are in what is famously called the prison house of language, remember that deconstruction and other schools, other methods in post-structuralism also has a clearly political angle to it. Okay? As critics like Derrida would argue that deconstruction is not just clinical method of showing how meaning disappears or showing how there are no pure signifieds, or that the text destroys itself or deconstructs itself, or that the text is already deconstructed. That is one part of the philosophical explanation or philosophical orientation of deconstruction. The other is clearly political. Okay? And deconstruction seeks to show us that any stable meaning or any demand or claim over one meaning or set of meanings is always an act of power. So, it is also a way of taking a position on a text, okay, which he called reading against the grain of the text, reading against the texture of a text, reading against the obvious conventional, so to speak, spontaneous meaning of a text. We believe in deconstruction that we are trained to read in a certain way, okay, and our culture, cultural assumptions and biases also kind of make us do spontaneous readings of a text by eliciting certain signifieds for a signifier. What Derrida says is read against the text, deconstruct it in a bit to show how it has been constructed by language and how it cannot reach one particular meaning. So, therefore, it is also, as it says here, concerned with the political and institutional structures that make possible and govern our practices. These govern our practices, our competencies and our performances, even our performances on a text. Okay, even the analysis you do on a text are tied to our practices within certain institutional power based structures, political structures that make us seemingly or give us seemingly spontaneous, which we feel are correct responses to a text. Okay. So, these are some I would think some of the cautionary or points of caution that post-structuralism very rightly gives us. Then, as I said about how a text is already dismantled, this comes from Hillis Miller, and where he says that deconstruction is not a dismantling of the structure of a text, but a demonstration that it has already dismantled itself, right. Where formalism seeks to demonstrate that a work has essential unity because, despite the paradoxes and irony that create its inner tension, deconstruction seeks to show that a text has no organic unity or basis for presenting meanings, only, as it says here, a series of conflicting significations. This is very important. Okay. Formalism also belongs to a particular way of looking at a text. Okay. A new criticism also belongs to that way of looking at the text, looking at the words on the text. Okay. How is deconstruction different? Deconstruction is different according to J. Hillis Miller, that it refuses a totality, it refuses an organic unity to the text, and it says that there are only conflicting significations of a text, and that the fact that the text is already sort of already impure in that sense, and sense of pure meanings, not having pure meanings, the very act of reading has to show the conflicting interpretations or the conflicting signification in a text. That is essentially the job of, or you could say the method of a deconstructive critique, okay, to show the conflicting signifieds or the conflicting processes of signification in a text and to deny the text a single meaning. Therefore, deconstruction, as has been shown, is not really a form of critique according to some, according to others. It is not a method, it is not a theory, it is not a discourse or an operation. It is a reiteration, okay? It is a reiteration of the fact that the text is already dismantled, that the text is already deconstructed. So, therefore, it goes against what Derrida calls the logocentrism or the metaphysics of presence in Western philosophy, and it says that there is no logos or there is no core or essence or truth, right? There is no center. The moment you have a center or a core or an essence or a truth, we end up privileging one reading over the other, because if you have a core, then you always have something on the margins, okay, something in the periphery, right. So, any act of saying that this is the core of a text, this is the essence of a text, is an act of power, and it betrays the logocentrism on, or what he calls the metaphysics of presence in the reader, right, and there are no transcendental or pure signifieds. Now, I will quickly end by referring to the reading by Christopher Prendergast of Derrida's Hamlet. Okay. Now, here he says that for someone like Derrida, the significance of the ghost of Hamlet's father resides in his radical indeterminacy. If you, what are the opening words of Shakespeare's Hamlet, where we have the guard saying, "Who's there?" And many have taken this as a cue to forming a deconstructive reading. Okay, "Who's there" talks about in one sense, okay, the indeterminacy of, it's not just a guard saying who's there, right. So, it symbolizes the indeterminacy of, or the impossibility of knowing, or not, or the fact that you don't know who's there, right. So, this also is attached to the figure of the ghost of Hamlet's father, right. For Derrida, the significance of the ghost resides in its radical indeterminacy. You know that Hamlet is also not sure whether it is a hallucination, or whether it's an evil spirit that has conjured the ghost of his father, who then exhorts him to take revenge. Okay. In Spectres of Marx by Derrida, says Christopher Prendergast, it is indeterminate in the more strictly ontological register of occupying a place, non-place between presence and absence, appearance and disappearance. So, really the ghost of Hamlet's father, by its very nature, okay, of being and not being, right, in the scene, of inhabiting a place which is midway between presence and absence, between appearance and disappearance, on residing in a somewhere between a place and a non-place, right. So, he says that in this, it's symbolic of what the deconstructionist is trying to say, that words too also occupy this non-space, and that is why its signification can never be finally grasped. The spectre, let us read on, the spectre is a thing and yet not a thing, not a substance. It hovers uncertainly between material embodiment and disembodiment. It inhabits a place of pure virtuality, and what in that space is swallowed up is the ontological ground of being itself. Okay. So, the most important word here is that post-structuralism in general does away with ontology or essences, right. There are no essences in post-structuralism. Okay. All that we can have are really traces, is another word here. We can have traces, we can have supplements, but we cannot have the word, literally cannot have the word in its, you can't have the word in its totality, okay, because the word meaning therefore is always slippery and it escapes our grasp. That is the very nature of language. Then Niall Lucy, and we carry this on. Niall Lucy says here, I am using Shakespeare's play, and talking about how a few critics have talked about Shakespeare's play in that to show more light on how we can symbolically connect it to deconstruction. Who's there? This is what we referred to a while ago. Who's there? The opening words is not a question we would ever ask of something like hydrogen. But it is the question that Bernardo asks at the very beginning of Shakespeare's Hamlet, and we might say that this question which opens the play remains open still at the end. In Hamlet, the question of who or what is there. The ghost in Hamlet could be said to pose the question, who am I? When am I? What is my being? What is my time? For Derrida, these cannot be confined to effects upon the characters and events in that text itself. Okay? They extend rather to questions of being and time in general, and this is a philosophical aspect of post-structuralism. We do not have much time here. I would have liked to talk to deconstruct or show the deconstructed nature of the text by using a poem like we did in structuralism, but I hope I have been able to at least tell you or convey to you some of the important points in post-structuralism. There is no point really in saying that deconstruction, there is no deconstruction can never be a method, because it already says that language is impure, then that we can never mean anything. That is not the point. That is really arguing, as I said, ad absurdum. right. The point here is that we understand we do use language, but at the same time we have to understand that language is by its very nature, because a term is part of a system. Okay, there is nothing ontological about it, it's always relational. Okay, we have to understand that language is deficient in that sense of where where the delineating of a full meaning is concerned. That is what deconstruction is talking about. It's not talking about destruction or utter chaos or randomness or things ridiculous. Therefore, according to Derrida, texts have gaps, texts have aberrations, and texts have inconsistencies, which is the job of the deconstructionist to show. Reading against what he says, reading against the grain of the text. And he says here, the reading must always aim at a certain relationship unperceived by the writer between what he commands and what he does not command, of the patterns of, how beautifully put, of the patterns of the language that he uses. So, these gaps, aberrations and inconsistencies are what need to be foregrounded. Actually, how the methodology goes, and as a method, then you take a text and you show how you break it down, you show how, or rather the text breaks down how the text will defeat their stated aims and purposes, rely on false or unsustainable oppositions, make use of figurative terms, reverse their own arguments, depend on other texts and signs as an intertextuality, conceal arguments that are the very opposite of what they ostensibly show. So, quickly now let us look at just one or two questions. For instance, if you get a question like, what is post-structuralism's take on knowledge? That is, how does post-structuralism consider knowledge? The answer is this: in post-structuralism, knowledge is not a question of true discovery, but it is seen as interpretation, and the privileging of any one interpretation of a text is seen as an act of power. Next, how does the approach to meaning in structuralism differ from that in post-structuralism? The previous question was to do with knowledge. How does post-structuralism consider knowledge? How does it look at knowledge? How does it define knowledge, right? Here it is with meaning. How does the approach to meaning differ in structuralism, and how does it differ from that in post-structuralism? And the answer is that in structuralism there was a certainty of knowledge, in the sense that we admitted the fact that meaning is always differential in a system. Meaning is relational, that words or terms, signs are related to other signs, and the meaning of a sign emanates from its difference. Okay, that is why meaning is differential in structuralism. Yet we saw that meaning is graspable. We can grasp meaning because there is a stability in the structure, right? There is a framework, there is a stability, and it is an organization after all of signs. It is not a disorganization of signs, and signs you can arrive at some sort of meaning. But we saw in post-structuralism that in the post-structuralist approach to meaning is this, that there can never be a complete meaning, whether it is a sign or whether it is this a collection of signs as we find in a text, right. So, meaning is endlessly deferred, and remember we looked at two words and how they are collapsed to form another word called deference, right. To differ and to defer, okay. That is meaning, no doubt under structuralism is differential, signs differ from other signs, and that is how they get their meanings. But we have an additional additional proposition here, is that meaning is always also deferred, that meaning is always postponed. You can never have a full meaning from a signified. The way it is put is in this way by Derrida, that is, meaning there are no pure signifieds, okay, or there is no transcendental signified, that is, it transcends all cultures or structures, okay. There can never be a transcendental signified. Signifiers will always have at different times and places different signifieds, and the fact is that all these signifieds are also signifiers, okay, they give rise to signifiers, and the fact is that these signifiers, the text becomes then a play of signifiers, right. So, we then end our lecture here, and I would want you to go back if you have to understand post-structuralism, there is also a need to go back to the structuralist methodology. Okay, you cannot understand post-structuralism without structuralism. Maybe you can say you can understand structuralism if you without looking at post-structuralism, but it's not the other way around. First, you have to understand, as we said in the beginning of this lecture, that structuralism, post-structuralism takes off from structuralism. Okay, that the post here is not just a temporal post of, say, post World War I, etc. Okay, it is a post in the sense that it retains and admits some of the core premises of structuralism, but it gives eventually a radical twist to it. Okay, transforms it and critiques it. Okay, and the most important important point linking it to structuralism, I would say, in my reading, is the sign and the idea of differentiality. Okay, it definitely as in structuralism, there is meaning through a differential relationship, but in post-structuralism, though it is retained, the other part is more important, that there is always a deferral of meaning, because by nature language is such that there can never be any pure signifiers because of the traces, substitutions and echoes from other signifiers. Thank you so much.